Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Profs at the Pub. My name is Samantha Putnam. I'm the Executive Director for Alumni Affairs. It's wonderful to have you join us this evening. I'd like to start by thanking our program staff for their support in putting this event together. We have Julie Mickleberry, Nick Hernandez, Arushi, and Jalissa. And I'm very grateful for the support that they've done to put this event together. We have run Profs at the Pub for a number of years now, and it's an incredible way for us to showcase the campus and some of the incredible exposure and education that our students are getting, and bring it to our alumni community. And hopefully it continues to foster a sense of pride to you as alumni, and also helps you to be those ambassadors in our community. So when you think about, or maybe you encounter people that are thinking about applying to come to UCSB, or you're having conversations, you're really positioned to share some of the incredible things that are happening on campus. I'm incredibly grateful today that we are joined by Professor Amy Gonzales. Just a little housekeeping. We are recording this session. Please make use of the Q&A. We'll have time at the end to answer some of those questions. Thank you to those of you who participated in the poll. But I would like to introduce Professor Amy Gonzales. Professor Gonzales is an associate professor in the Department of Communications. She received her MA in social psychology from UT Austin and an MA and PhD in communications from Cornell. If you are curious and to learn more about Professor Gonzales's work, we'll put a few links in the chat for you to explore a little bit more. But I think we're about to hear an incredible showcase from Professor Gonzales, so I will hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha. And thanks to all of you for all of the work. You've been incredibly, comprehensive in everything you've done to help set this up. So I really appreciate it. And for inviting me. So I hope everyone in the audience has their libation of choice. If you'll bear with me for one moment while I share my screen. This will take just 1 second. Perfect. So hopefully you can see the slides now. And yeah, I was actually thinking, in order to make a, talk more fun 6 o'clock on a Thursday, that you guys should actually play a drinking game, so that every time I say digital divide or digital equity, you can take a drink, because I want to make sure I get really good questions at the end. So, and I've got a gin and tonic here, so you'll get good answers in response. Just kidding. Well, hopefully you get good answers, but it's definitely not a gin and tonic. So before I actually dive into the specific study that was advertised around a content analysis of legislation, I actually wanted to give you a bit of context for the kind of work that I historically have done to help you understand kind of how I got to this particular study. So most of my research has actually looked at who has access to technology and who doesn't, and what are the consequences of that. So, for example, I've done work on students and what happened to examine what happens when students don't have consistent or stable access to technology. Some of you may recognize the picture in the corner of elementary students during COVID who had to stand outside libraries or fast food restaurants in order to get access to the internet so they could do their homework, right? And so some of my work has looked at the fact that students have worse grades and higher stress levels when they don't have regular access to technology. I've looked at, bear with me, I'm going to time myself so that I make sure I don't go over, the consequences for employment. So given that so much of the employment process has been moved online as well, what happens if you're looking for part-time work, a minimum wage job, you don't have resources because you're not employed, and yet you need to make your way to the library or fill out a resume on your phone. There's a host of complications that arise with that when you don't have your resume stored on a device at the library, you can't remember your password, etc. And then I've also looked at a variety of health implications. What happens when we don't have reliable access to technology in a world where now your medical records are all online, your doctor's appointments and communication with doctors have often moved online. And in fact, increasingly our actual appointments themselves are online, right? So I've got some work that finds that when especially low-income individuals don't have stable access to something like a smartphone. Not only do they have worse health, but especially those who are the most isolated, who have the smallest support networks, they really suffer, right? Because these devices are not just our access to resources in the world and all of these different sectors, right? The marketplace, education, healthcare, but they're also our supports, right? Our access to our social lives. And so what I came to realize is that if I really want all of this research to have an impact, right, learning all of this and about these consequences of not having stable access to technology, I want policymakers and other stakeholders to use that information in a meaningful way. And so if that was the case, I wanted to first understand how individuals, or excuse me, how policymakers already are thinking about digital equity. Which aspects of the digital divide have already captured their attention? Are some more popular than others? Are some more likely to become legislation, depending on kind of the themes that are covered? And how does that maybe vary by partisan leaning? So do you see that Republicans are more likely to sponsor or support certain bills than Democrats, and vice versa? So to answer these questions, my graduate student, Jesse King, and I conducted this study where we're trying to examine through a content analysis the history of digital divide legislation over this 30-year period, which is really kind of the universe of all of this legislation, because you didn't get any before 1990, really, to understand what predicts the passage of a bill and also, again, partisan sponsorship. Now, I will say that I gave this talk somewhat recently at a telecom policy conference, and I have tried to kind of pull out the wonky, jargony language. But if at any point I'm confusing or you don't understand, feel free to drop something in the chat. And I've been told that you feel free to interrupt me, moderators, and ask for clarification, because I don't want people to be confused. I will say that just some key definitions. When we talk about frames, I'll define that a little bit more in a bit, but essentially we're talking about themes, right, or topics that you might find, in this case, in the legislation. And when we refer to content analysis, again, although we'll get into the methods a little bit more down in a few slides, but essentially it's just when a researcher takes any sort of group of texts or images, really, in this case, it's going to be all of the bills proposed in Congress, all of them during this 30-year period. And then the researcher just counts for specific themes, right? Specific frames. In this case, the number of instances in which certain types of digital equity or digital divide phenomena arise. When do they show up in those bills? Which brings us to this last definition, I think, which is, what do we mean by digital divide? What am I talking about when I even talk about the digital divide or digital equity? So before I give you a more formal definition there, let me just give you some data. These are data from Pew, which frequently puts out nationally representative data related to technology access, among many other things related to technology, how people use it, to what end. And what you can see here, these are some of their more recent data, that certainly income still plays a major role in predicting who has access to technology and who doesn't, right? A little bit less so with respect to smartphone ownership, but certainly when it comes to computer, like large screen devices and access to home broadband, income plays a huge role. Although I will say, since these data have been put out, COVID money trickled out to enable subsidy for broadband internet access. And so we've actually seen those numbers, those gaps kind of close a little bit, but they certainly still persist. Another way to kind of look at these data is to understand who is smartphone dependent. What we mean by that is who is primarily getting online at home, not through a computer or through home broadband, but simply through their phone, right? And for those making $30,000 or less, that's still 30% of the population. And in fact, has climbed as well for a variety of reasons. But needless to say, the digital divide is a reference to these disparities, which are not exclusively, but often income-based, or put kind of more formally, it's this gap between who has affordable access, but also skills and the larger support needed to really effectively engage online, and who doesn't, right? Digital equity is what's referred to as the condition which all individuals and communities would have that capacity, right? In order to fully participate in society, democracy, and our economy, because the reality is, as I kind of talked about at the start, and as most of us know, right, the irony is not lost on me that you are watching this talk because you have access to a computer. And in fact, I invited my parents on earlier who don't have Zoom. I realized I didn't help set them up. So we're seeing digital equity play out in real time. Well, maybe hopefully they've made their way on here. So something that the National Digital Inclusion Alliance says, which I appreciate, is if the digital divide is the issue and digital equity is the goal, then digital inclusion is the work needed to try to close those divides, right? They'll never close perfectly, but how do we get a little bit closer? And so in this particular case, what our attempt to kind of do some of that work is to understand what policymakers are thinking about, what have they been focusing on in the past when it comes to all of the ways that digital equity or the digital divide manifests, and how can that help us strategize for the future going forward as we're trying to build coalitions of stakeholders who are supportive of increasing digital equity, right? Now, studying frames is a long-standing tradition within communication scholarship, right? It's a means of understanding kind of the priorities of a population. Often we're looking at within the field frames within some sort of media content. But analysis of legislative frames also has a precedent, and it can really be used to signal kind of cultural values, but also what are these identified problems and possibly solutions to kind of contemporary phenomenon. And with respect to digital equity, there's actually good research. A great experiment put out a few years ago demonstrates that when you use different types of frames, you actually see different levels of support for policy. So the public, given a choice between understanding whether or not the digital equity is kind of a motivating or driven by kind of lack of motive versus lack of resources, changes the types of policies that people are willing to support, right? So frames matter. And then some of the limited research that has actually investigated different types of digital equity frames, typically it's focused on reports or press articles, has found that often the content falls into these two camps, that often the digital experience of the digital divide is either focusing on disparities or kind of innovation and competition. And I think that's really important because what you can already start to tease out there is that the digital divide is a bipartisan issue. It's actually really fun to work on a bipartisan issue. This is something that everybody cares about, all policymakers care about, but they do come at it from slightly different perspectives, right? And I think kind of understanding how the different themes, the different frames align with different partisan policies and preferences can be, again, a really useful strategy going forward. So in order to understand then how we picked which frames we were going to code in our study, we actually turned to this theory. Now, I understand that it seems like there's a lot going on here. I actually did indeed pull this straight from my class. But essentially what this slide is just saying is that there's a lot of, there's various demographic factors that predict the resources we have. And those resources are going to predict how we use technology, our access to technology and how we use it. And in turn, that use of technology is going to predict the resources we have, right? So it's this cyclical process between having access to technology, which predicts power and networks and access to income, and that all in turn predicts our access to technology. So with respect to this specific study, I decided we're going to pull out a few kind of key components of what we often in the scholars of the digital divide think of as the digital divide, with this emphasis on these two here. With respect to this first level divide, we're going to focus just on physical access. Do you have internet in the home? Do you have devices? And then also skills, right? What are the digital skills that people have and how does that shape outcomes? And then this third level divide, or often referred to as outcome, looks at what are the consequences of not having access to technology. We also looked at a variety of additional themes that simply come up that you could kind of tie back to these positional categories. I'm not going to get into that too much here. But in sum, ultimately, using this kind of theoretical framework, we wanted to understand, again, which frames are even the most common in legislation proposed in US Congress over time. So how do we see kind of certain themes come and go since over this 30-year period? And then again, perhaps more importantly, is there a relationship between the type of themes that you see in the bill that was proposed and whether or not that bill actually becomes law? And finally, is there a relationship between any of these themes, these frames within the bill and the political party of its sponsor, right? In other words, do Republicans sponsor certain kinds of digital divide bills over others? So this next slide is getting into the methodological weeds just a bit more, not too much, but I do want you to have context for how I actually conducted the study, right? How we actually found the data that we found. So in a content analysis, you take whatever frames you're interested in, and then you turn those into specific codes so that when you're reading through, in this case, the legislation, you can identify, do I see evidence of this code or that code? And these are not mutually exclusive. So most bills had many instances of these different codes. These first level divide codes looked at things like policies related to device donation or reuse or refurbishment, providing broadband access, right? Easing broadband regulation or any sort of funding or discussion of outreach. Second level policies, again, these are things related to skills. So any reference to digital literacy programs or encouraging privacy or cybersecurity programs. These are all things that help kind of encourage a more literate, digitally literate society. To what degree do we see evidence that there's a foregrounding of the outcomes, right? To what degree do the policymakers talk about economic, social, educational, political, or institutional implications? And by institution here, we mean, you know, are you using the internet to access government resources, sign up for Medicaid or Medicare, access healthcare information even? And then again, a variety of issue frames that I won't spend too much time on. The database was simply all congressional legislation, all bills ever proposed in Congress, which you could look up right now on congress.gov. We narrowed those to this 30-year period, which is just, we stopped right before COVID hit and some of the more recent legislation came out, but that was just happened to be when we collected these data. And then used a whole bunch of key terms and combinations of these terms to look for any relevant bills, right? And any instance of any of these terms showing up in the bill meant that it would kind of become part of the database, right? So the unit of analysis was the entire bill. We started with about 2,500 relevant bills, read through the abstracts and the titles, and that's what we kind of narrowed down to. And then from there, kind of culled to about, pulled out things that were related to national defense or voting machines. So there sometimes these words were pulling up kind of other common themes, environmental pollution. Ended up with what we identified as roughly 550 bills that somehow talked about digital equity, but then a lot of these are duplicates because that's how bills work, right? They don't make it into law, they come back another time. We pulled those out as well as any sort of appropriation bills, and ended up with 270 full bills in the analyses, and then trained two coders who didn't know what our research questions were to use the code book to identify, right, objectively and hopefully in the same way, which is what this reliability score means, that they are seeing evidence of any of these given frames. So here's some of the data in response to this first research question. These are the darker blue line are the total number of digital equity bills over time. The lighter blue line are those bills related to physical access, the first level divide, right? So what you can see right away is that these are the most common, that 84% of all the bills in our database had some sort of reference to kind of making sure that there was a physical access to technology. And that kind of makes sense, right? That's kind of a precursor, one might argue. Although interestingly, it's consistently the most common, right, over time. It doesn't drop off in any way. Of these, more than half were specifically about broadband access. And that's actually pretty interesting to me as a person who's largely studied computers, because I think there's often this privileging of internet access, despite the fact that computers themselves, according to some recent data I have, may even be more important for, accessing societal resources, because you can take that computer out to a McDonald's, you can't take your home broadband with you. In any case, this is often where I think the imagination of policymakers has been. And of course, for good reason. Home broadband access is really important. Least common were bills related to skills. So these second level divide skills. Of those that were there, essentially all of them, almost all of them, were referencing some sort of digital literacy programming. Those are the pink line. And then finally, and not surprisingly, right, most of the bills talked about the consequence of having or not having access. So a little bit more than half. And of those, about 40% were either talking about educational outcomes or economic outcomes, or sometimes both. The third most common theme was access to institutional resources, again. So now that you've got kind of a picture of what was being talked about over the last 30 years in bills proposed in Congress, this, again, probably more interesting question, is there then a relationship between any of those themes and what actually becomes a bill, right? What actually becomes legislation? What becomes a law? And so there were a few findings here. We conducted logistic regression analyses. We did control for the year that the bill was introduced and which political party was in power in both the House and the Senate. And we can kind of talk about the limitations of that or the strengths of that at the end. But what we found is that if a bill had reference to educational outcomes, it was almost 3 times as likely, or 2.7 times likely, more likely to become a law, right? To actually pass into becoming law. We also saw something similar for bills discussing corporate transparency. And I'll get into what that means or why I think that is in a little bit more detail in a second. But essentially what we meant by corporate transparency is reference to any sort of legislating that ensured that internet service providers are accurately reporting out the spread of their service, kind of the reach of their service, because actually that is where we get that information. There's no external intervention to check whether or not ISPs are providing service where they say they are. So that's been kind of an ongoing issue in Congress. Finally, if a Republican sponsored a bill, it was more likely to then also become law. Which is a good segue into then what are the differences in the type of content you see depending on whether or not a Republican versus a Democrat sponsored that bill. So here we pulled out, I think, maybe the one bill that was sponsored by an independent, and the larger numbers are associated with Republican sponsorship. And what we see there is, perhaps not surprising, easing broadband regulation was more likely to be seen in bills that were sponsored by Republicans. Bills referencing privacy and security, again, bills referencing this corporate transparency. And I think that was kind of surprising to us because you think of corporate transparency as kind of government oversight. But what became clear in these bills is that often this discussion about the need for greater transparency was kind of wedded to the ability to have greater market competition, right? Finally, and not surprising, those bills that had reference to increasing rural access were more likely to be sponsored by Republicans. Democratic sponsored bills, you saw more likely to have reference to digital literacy programs. And again, more likely to be referencing educational outcomes. So educational outcomes matter for Democrats in particular, but also across the board. So what does all that mean? Right, so we've got some insights into, again, the political leanings of and that kind of alignment between party affiliation or and different aspects of the digital divide. I thought a hat tip to a friend of mine who gave me this inspiration for maybe a good way to illustrate, I think, why this matters. So if you'll bear with me for just 1 second.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill. Hey, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage. Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law.
So apart from some well-earned nostalgia at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, I think this kind of throwback civics lesson is helpful in a couple of different ways. First, it reminds us that a lot goes into a bill. And of course, this is a very simplified version of that. But there are multiple stakeholders, right? There's citizens talking to their representatives. There are not shown lobbyists and interest groups. The political climate matters. In fact, the next scene here in this lovely cartoon is showing the Congress people kind of fighting, which, today would be involve actual fisticuffs. But in any case, this is a long process with lots of different, again, voices. And so the first thing I want to note is that I want to acknowledge that although we controlled, again, for a few different factors, we're very clear that there are certainly hundreds of other factors at play that determine what is actually going to become a bill or not, right? And we don't pretend that frames of that content are the only factor or even the primary factor. But I do think that these data suggest that they matter, right? That they are a factor, which leads to the kind of second point of this sweet little cartoon, which is this reminder that legislation is a conversation, right, between citizens and policymakers, that if advocates then of digital equity, and whether that's kind of individuals in this room all the way up to kind of national coalitions, have information like this, they can perhaps be more strategic, not just in trying to get a specific bill passed, but again, in forming coalitions, right, across the aisle. And so, if I'm talking to a Republican, do I emphasize the benefits of a given policy for my rural voters? Or, if I'm trying to get a bill passed that's increasing kind of devices and internet services for veterans because I want to make sure they can access their, healthcare providers, do I want to also focus on some of the educational benefits of that, given what we know, right? Is that going to perhaps appeal to a wider range of policymakers? And so I think, again, these strategies can perhaps be helpful as we understand new legislation making its way through the pipeline. So I'll end there, but I just wanted to throw up some recent legislation for those of you that might be interested, both at the federal and state level, and then national and even some really exciting local organizations that are focusing on digital equity and digital divide issues. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was fantastic and really informative. And anytime somebody mentions the term 30 years ago and then that it was the 90s is still super jarring because that should be the 70s, right?
Yeah,
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions that we'll go through. One of the first ones was, does access to tech really doesn't access to tech really correlate to finances? So wouldn't finances be the bigger issue, or is that just one of the aspects that you look at?
Absolutely, right. So, and that's why, as I said, kind of in most of my work, that's what I've done, is kind of often interviewed or surveyed a disproportionate number of low-income households to understand what exactly their struggles are. I'm doing research on that right now, right, on understanding kind of how people seek tech support in the region when they don't have really well-resourced families, or tech support that I can call like LSIT, right? What do they do and where do they go? So certainly that is actually where probably the majority of certainly my scholarship has been. But again, for me, this was kind of an interesting opportunity to zoom out a little bit to get a bigger picture as to kind of what matters to a range of stakeholders, right? And I think it's interesting to kind of see how, certainly economics matter, but something like the educational implications of technology become kind of a lever that I think people are willing to pull. So then understanding then what's that relationship between economics and education, right? How do we kind of dig into those disparities to then address these kind of digital divide issues as well? But yes, I certainly hear that point, that studying technology sometimes feels like a very small piece of a much larger kind of structure of socioeconomic inequality.
Wonderful. We have another question. It looks like the educational outcome wasn't statistically significant in the importance for either party.
It was the importance for either party.
Or the educational outcome wasn't statistically significant in
It
importance.
might be referring to the fact that it's marginally significant, right? So yes, that I kind of debated whether or not I wanted to get into that in this particular context. It is significant at what kind of a more relaxed criterion. Maybe that's what the person's referring to. And so, but given the very few number of bills that are ultimately in this database, and that this is actually reflective of the universe, right? This isn't an actual sample. I felt like it was still kind of worth pointing to that. I'm not sure that's what the person's asking about, but if it is, that's kind of my response to that, the fact that I included marginally statistically significant variables as well.
Thank you. I wanted to give a shout out to the cartoon because as someone, as you can tell from my accent, was not from this country, I thought I had seen that right when I came. So it's really helpful. Another question is that UCSB is known to be a really interdisciplinary campus. With the research that you are unearthing, do you share some of that with your colleagues in perhaps the political science department for discussion with some of their work? How does your research inform your work on campus in a cross-disciplinary way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that I have had regular conversations since I've been here, partly through the CITS, Center for Information Technology here on campus, which is an interdisciplinary center. But I've been in touch with people in computer science. Elizabeth Belding and I actually often kind of play in the same spaces. But actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because as a function of this talk being promoted, I had people reach out to me, for example, in Bren, who were looking at kind of policy, content analysis of environmental policy. And so we kind of talked about possible collaborations in the future. So I'm always open to kind of cross-disciplinary conversations. I think that those are often really fun and exciting ways to make sure you're doing work that really matters.
Yeah.
So opportunities.
That's really exciting. That's one of the things as a staff member I feel really proud of when we talk about the collaboration that happens on this campus. And so that's really exciting to hear that that you've experienced this as a consequence of participating here. Speaking of collaborators and a former Profs at the Pub presenter, Joe Walther, he has a question. So many descriptions of social media and the internet describe it as free to everybody. Your work is so valuable because it reminds us that everybody needs $800 plus to get started and $20 plus a month to keep it going. Is the internet truly, the internet is free, as a stereotype, a barrier to progress?
Yeah, it's so hard, Joe, because you become biased by your own tiny world, right? So because I swim so much in a digital equity space, I don't think about that. But you're right. I think especially when it comes to social media, that is in that literature, right? When we're talking about access to the internet or devices, I think people kind of immediately get that expense, but we forget that we can only access that social media through that internet and devices, which are very costly. I will say it's interesting. Sometimes when I talk about the research that I do, so example, when I was actually in a van showing up for my job interview here, I told the person that what I was going to talk about, that access to technology or use of media, and they immediately assumed that I was suggesting that it's good not to have access, right? And so when it comes to something like social media, I think that there's these really interesting questions about which people in the digital divide sphere talk about a lot, right? Is wanting to make sure, and the way I think about it is wanting to make sure people have access when they want the option to have it, that they have the option of access when they need it, right? But it's not presumed that all access to technology is good or bad. With respect to your kind of the underbelly of your question, right? Do we assume that, I think that maybe the question, what I would say is that people who are studying social media would do a service to kind of a wider range of socioeconomic strata if they considered in kind of implications discussion sections what happens when the quality of that access is compromised due to these resources, which you're right, I think is often overlooked.
Thank you. We have another question, wondering about how your research can be utilized as far as having those of us who care about digital equity do some of the work of making the digital divide shrink. What can the average person do to help galvanize this bipartisan issue, and how do we enact equity?
Yeah, it's such a
That's a
good
great question.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that's why I put up some of those resources at the end, and I'm happy to share them in another capacity as well, if that's helpful. Feel free to reach out to me personally. I can tell you about kind of local kind of organizations. And in fact, even here on campus, I've really seen since I've been here over the past 5 years, and it's no small part due to COVID, that the basic needs office on campus, just as a place to start. I don't know if the person asking is still regional or not, but Basic Needs has really started appreciating technology as a basic need and has created kind of a whole host of resources for students who need laptop loans or money to buy an emergency computer when it dies in the middle of finals and they don't have, you know, as Joe said, the $800 on hand. So there's kind of a whole bunch of different ways you could get involved. I would say another, this comes to mind just because one of the studies I'm doing right now is, again, on tech support and kind of socioeconomic differences and who has access to support. And I've come across a lot of really cool kind of grassroots organizations because there's no government institutionalized tech support resource, which is part of the kind of conversation I'm having in this paper, right? It's people going to the library, it's people getting it at their work. One thing that often is happening is that people are volunteering in places like senior centers. There are programs that hook up high school students with seniors as kind of as needed ad hoc tech support can be really cool. So you could even volunteer your time in that way. So it kind of depends the scale at which you would one wants to get involved. But I got a whole bunch of ideas I'd be happy to talk about anyone with anyone that's interested.
That's fantastic. I think we have one final question for you. What are your thoughts on the difference between supporting programs that offer grants to get devices, where an individual is able to possess the item and usually take better care, compared to broader access through a library or shared programs in both rural and urban areas at a cheaper price with limited accessibility? Additionally, does your response change comparing different groups of people, for example, K through 12 versus senior citizens versus young adults? Another great question there. Thank you to our anonymous question answer asker there.
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually allows me to talk about, again, this research. I've just analyzed some census data. And what we find is, which in some ways is not surprising, that again, actually access to in-home devices is more important for using the internet in beneficial ways. So people who have a computer at home, a large screen device at home, were much more likely to then say, I use the internet to look for work, to look up information about government resources, to engage in a whole bunch of, to talk to my doctor, right? It was a stronger predictor of those behaviors than having internet at home. And when we split the sample and looked at people who didn't have internet at home and people who did, because initially we just control for that, we find that there's still a positive relationship of having access to a device, even in homes that don't have the internet, right? And again, that's because I think people are taking those devices outside of the home. What was interesting as well is that smartphone access is also positively correlated with engaging in these kind of outcomes, these beneficial uses of the internet. But there, it was only in homes that had access to the internet in the house. In homes that didn't have access to the internet, you actually saw a no effect of smartphones on some of these more beneficial uses of the internet, or you saw negative effects, negative relationships. So people who are smartphone dependent, no internet at home, were actually less likely to be using the internet for healthcare purposes, for example, than people who didn't have a smartphone at all. There's a lot of different variables going on again, but I don't know, that's kind of a roundabout way of me saying that I think computers really matter, and having resources in the home really matters. Now, is getting it into public space more important than nothing? Is that better than nothing? Absolutely. But I think this is what we've really seen at the federal level, whereas 10 years ago, major federal funding during the stimulus all went to public community centers. Now, $14 billion went just to the FCC to subsidize in-home internet access. And we're seeing lots of other funding kind of trickle out that's really trying to focus on getting people the resources in their home. So it's probably a good place to leave that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your talk and for your thorough responses to the questions. Our team have placed a few links in the chat, and hopefully folks were able to grab those. We have lots of other ways that you can get connected for those of you who are interested in learning more about the Alumni Association. You can join Gaucho Network. You can also check out our website, which is alumni.ucsb.edu. But thank you so much this evening to Amy and to my staff again who helped put this together. We will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and for those that were unable to make it this evening, we'll be able to share that with them. But thank you again, Amy. It was incredible to hear about your research and share that with our audience. So thank you. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you all for coming.